I am in Hermitage, Tennessee, near Nashville, and I am at the Hermitage, the home of President and General Andrew Jackson. He is a very controversial figure in American history, but nonetheless extremely critical to American politics and history. So we're gonna go check this place out. This is the third most visited presidential home in the country, after Mount Vernon and Monticello. I'm entering through the visitor center, which we'll return to for the great museum they have in here. The Hermitage is a National Historic Landmark. After taking a short walk from the visitor center, you reach the old carriage road of the country plantation that led directly to the front entrance of the Hermitage. The carriage road loop is shaped like a guitar, very appropriate for Nashville. That is the home of President Andrew Jackson, with lots of large cedar trees in front. While Jackson had owned this property since 1804, he commissioned this mansion in 1819, and it was completed in 1821. This side is the formal entrance that faces away from the plantation fields and slave quarters, so this is where esteemed dignitaries would enter. The building has a beautiful Greek Revival portico. The portico has 6 wooden Corinthian-style columns. The bricks of the mansion were produced on site with slave labor. So we're about to go into the Hermitage Mansion. I usually do try to keep my videos positive, but I do have some complaints about the process of visiting the inside of the mansion. Yes, there is a lot of people who want in, so you do have to wait in line sometimes for half an hour to an hour. However, it is extremely rushed and you don't really get that much time to look around. I would let that slide. However, they do not allow photography inside. This breezeway porch portico was added around 1831. The home's interior was also redone at that time while Jackson was away in DC as president. You can view the formal dining room once you've exited the home. Slightly detached from the main house is the kitchen. Of course, they had several slaves and servants working in here. And in a separate building nearby is the smokehouse. There is Andrew Jackson's well. Andrew Jackson retired from public life in 1837 as his second term as president concluded, so he lived here full time. He had never really been here much before that, so he enjoyed his plantation and celebrity hero status until he died here on June 8, 1845 at age 78. He had actually purchased the original 420 acres of land in 1804. Which he named the Hermitage. He did purchase the land after the natives were pushed out of here. Jackson would end up having a lot more experience with that throughout his military and political career. You can ride on a horse-drawn wagon at the Hermitage. Those are the archaeological remains of some slave cabins. Within very close proximity of the Hermitage Mansion is the cabin of Uncle Alfred. He was born to Andrew Jackson's enslaved Maine cook, and Alfred lived here longer than anyone on record. And in time he became the general's personal manservant. After the general died and then the slaves were emancipated in 1865, he stayed on the land and became a tenant farmer, still living in this log cabin. When the Hermitage mansion fell into disrepair in the late 19th century, Alfred purchased some original Jackson furnishings with his little tenant farmer money. In 2003, the Hermitage finally gained all the original 1,050 acres that Jackson owned at his death. This was a cotton field. Cotton was the major cash crop of Middle Tennessee at the time, so these cotton fields were where most slaves worked. There were also several domestic and artisan slaves. Jackson started this farm with 9 African slaves, but he owned about 110 at the time of his death. This is the site of the first Hermitage, and here are 2 original slave cabins. When Andrew and Rachel first moved here to this property, they moved into a log cabin which had already existed. Back in the old days of the Hermitage Museum, the slavery aspect was completely ignored, so they just said that the Jacksons lived in this hardscrabble log cabin. However, the original cabin's materials were used to build these slave cabins later on, so they said that Andrew Jackson actually lived in what was a slave cabin. There's an original floor beam. Here are some archaeological relics found around these slave quarters. The monetary value of the enslaved people here far exceeded the combined worth of the land, mansion, and possessions. Jackson did refer to his slaves as his extended black family, and if he liked them, he was apparently kind to them. However, if he didn't like their behavior, Jackson, in Jacksonian manner, brutally unleashed his wrath, and that included physical violence. This was the spring house. In a garden just a short ways to the east of the Hermitage mansion is the garden where General Andrew Jackson is buried. There are a few graves of extended family members that are buried next to the big tomb. First Lady Rachel Jackson suddenly died on December 22, 1828. Jackson was very devastated, especially considering the issues around the time of her death. He decided to have her buried in her beloved garden next to the mansion. In 1831, as the Hermitage was being renovated during his first term, he had the architect in charge design and build this tomb for both of them. Rachel's tombstone says, quote, "A being so gentle and so virtuous, slander might wound, but could not dishonor." The tomb is just like a Greek temple that can be found on the Telemachus wallpaper inside that Rachel had chosen. The tomb was completed in 1832. When Jackson returned to the Hermitage after the presidency, he visited the tomb daily if he could. The general died in 1845 and was laid to rest 2 days later in this Greek temple tomb. During Andrew Jackson's funeral, his African gray parrot named Paul was removed because he couldn't stop cursing, probably using colorful phrases he picked up from the president. Jackson was the Grand Master of Tennessee from 1822 to 1823. A young Andrew Jackson participated in the surprise attack of the Battle of Hanging Rock in 1780 against the British after the fall of Charleston. The Americans killed 192 British soldiers, while they only lost 12. Rachel was the daughter of Revolutionary War Colonel John Donaldson. This is Uncle Alfred's grave. As I mentioned, he had bought several Jackson furnishings. When it was being turned into a museum by the Hermitage Ladies Association, they wanted him to donate the furnishings. He said he would if he were buried right next to the president, and the ladies held up their end of the bargain. Uncle Alfred lived here for all 98 years of his life and likely never left the Hermitage, and is laid to rest in the shadow of the towering tomb of General Jackson, who probably would not have approved of this. There are now hickory and willow trees planted around the tomb. So that was the Hermitage Mansion and Grounds. Pretty fascinating place. Now we're gonna head back into the visitor center to see the museum. This portrait of Andrew Jackson depicts him in front of the Hermitage. This is Andrew Jackson's eagle head sword. He carried this during the Battle of New Orleans. This sword wasn't purely decorative, he might have actually used this to stab some British, but it has a freaking eagle head on the hilt. That's pretty cool. This was General John Coffey's sword, which he carried at New Orleans. He was in charge of the regiment of the Tennessee Militia. This is an 1817 portrait of General Andrew Jackson. The artist planned to use this portrait as a basis for a panoramic painting, which sadly was never completed. That was Major John Reed's bicorn hat and his epaulets. He was General Jackson's aide. Jackson's big victory at New Orleans, which happened to be after the Treaty of Ghent, launched him into celebrity status across the country, which allowed him to enter politics and also got him a lot of cool stuff. The Americans were very outnumbered, but still under Jackson's leadership beat the crap out of the British and secured one of the most important port cities in North America. This is a British uniform which was presented to Jackson after the battle. There's a cavalry sword, an English dirk, and a dueling pistol. Jackson participated in a lot of duels. Depending on what source you look at, some say 5 or 13, some even say over 100. Here are some ghostly statues of Andrew and Rachel Jackson. Rachel was legally married to another man when she and Andrew went off and got married. This would widely be used against them by political enemies later on. These commemorative medals of Andrew Jackson were approved by Congress after the Treaty of Ghent. This beautiful presentation sword was given to him by a group of Philadelphia citizens due to his victory at New Orleans. This French pocket watch was likely given to Jackson by a French citizen of New Orleans. It is inscribed with Jackson's name. That is a locket with Andrew Jackson's hair. There was a whole merch line based on Jackson at this point, but a genuine lock of his hair was the ultimate souvenir. This was Rachel Jackson's necklace, presented to her in New Orleans. One observer at this event described Rachel as a short, fat dumpling. The Jacksonian era was a huge shift in American politics. Jackson ran for president in 1824. His supporters split off from the Democratic-Republican Party and formed the Democratic Party. That election was inconclusive, went to the House, and the corrupt bargain happened that upheld John Quincy Adams as president, but he did defeat Adams in the 1828 presidential election. Jacksonian democracy was widely supported, especially in the West, as Jackson railed against the elites like Adams and Henry Clay. Jackson also supported in the States the expansion of suffrage to all white men, which was gradually passed at this time. And he also believed that the executive should have more political leverage, which he certainly exercised as president. This 1824 copy of the Niles Weekly Register shows the electoral votes that were most up to date at that point. Voting took a lot longer back then, and there wasn't even a national election day. This is a commemorative gold box that was presented to him by the mayor of New York. That is Jackson's watch fob, with symbols of a liberty pole and cap, symbols which date back to ancient Rome. This is Andrew Jackson's medicine chest. He had severe health issues, largely because of several bullets that remained in his body throughout his life. He tried many toxic medications for relief, and he believed in heroic medicine, the idea that severe and painful side effects were proof that it was working. This Andrew Jackson Hero of New Orleans medal was in circulation after the war. These are Andrew Jackson's eyeglasses and their case. He wore these for reading and writing. These are some more relics recovered from the slave quarters area, including marbles used by the children, sewing implements, and some eyeglasses that were recovered. These dining items were all presented to the Jacksons. Oh boy, here's an opinion board about Andrew Jackson. Some talk of his positives, like that he was the only president to pay off the national debt, or stating the negatives, like the fact that he owned a lot of slaves here, and a lot of people just like the parrot cursing story. This is Andrew Jackson's carriage. It is obviously very luxurious, but it's also really well restored. This was the one he used as president in Washington, D.C. This is Clark Mills's model of the equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson that was placed in Lafayette Square in front of the White House after his death. It was an engineering marvel because all the weight is on the horse's two back feet, and it was the first equestrian statue in the country. This is one of Andrew Jackson's hickory canes, which he probably used to beat someone up with. On the left is an anti-national bank pamphlet in support of Jackson's big decision to remove the government's money from the National Bank before he destroyed it completely, and the book on the right contains Jackson's messages to Congress. These copper tokens feature satirical messages regarding Jackson's anti-national bank policy. There's an Andrew Jackson political ribbon, and this listed candidates of the Pennsylvania Assembly who supported Jackson's national bank decision. This is a German biography of Andrew Jackson that was written before the 1832 presidential election, probably an attempt to get the German vote in Pennsylvania. This is a political cartoon that satirizes the Petticoat Affair, the drama between all the wives of Andrew Jackson's cabinet. This is an Indian peace medal depicting Andrew Jackson. This was Rachel Jackson's original tombstone from the garden. She was victim to a lot of slander and attacks in the press during the 1828 campaign, and this caused her pre-existing health conditions to worsen. And after she died before they could go to Washington, Jackson always blamed his political enemies for her death. This was Andrew Jackson's mourning hat, which he put a black band around. This booklet was made after his inauguration. It includes his speech, some music, and a memorial poem in honor of Rachel. These are some very early political buttons. This was a pretty new thing at the time. This was Rachel Jackson's veil. This was made by the ladies of Cincinnati to wear at Andrew Jackson's inauguration, but of course, she was never able to. This is a poem about the death of Mrs. Jackson, Rachel's hymnal that she took to church, and a small portrait of her. This case contains some more merits and honors that were made for President Jackson. This sword was presented to him in 1819 by the Tennessee legislature for the victory of New Orleans. A little ways from the visitor center and mansion, but still on the property, is the Jackson Family Church and Cemetery. This is the grave of First Lady Emily Tennessee Donaldson. As Andrew Jackson went into the White House a widower, he needed a First Lady, so he used his niece Emily until she died in 1836. She died at age 29, making her the youngest ever dead First Lady. In 1948, her grave, along with the entire cemetery that was at the plantation of the Donaldsons, were dug up and buried here at the Hermitage. Emily probably wouldn't have approved that, since she and her uncle did not get along well. This is a memorial to Colonel John Donaldson and Rachel Donaldson, Rachel Jackson's parents, who were killed by Indians in Kentucky in 1785. In the late 19th century, much of the Hermitage land was owned by the state of Tennessee, so a Confederate soldiers' home was built on the land. In 1892, it was a residence for poor and disabled Confederate veterans. "480 Confederates who died at the home are buried here at the Hermitage in a circular pattern around this mound." Next to the Confederate cemetery is where in 2006, the remains of 61 enslaved people who were owned by Rachel Jackson's nephews were discovered. So this memorial was built on the site for the hundreds of slaves who worked and died here at the Hermitage and are buried on this ground and in other places that haven't been located. So the Hermitage is an amazing and dynamic piece of American history. Please check out my other videos of presidential sites, museums, and much more. And thanks for watching.